Hello again, I'm Greg. This is part 3 of section 3 of our exploration of basic hermeneutics. We are working with music, as you know, and of course, inevitably, at some point when we're working with music, just as when we were working with art, visual arts, one would want to actually either look at the stuff we're talking about or, in this case, listen to it. So I encourage you, as we go through these works, we're going to talk about specific works that have made a claim within the history of music, history of art, and the history of aesthetics more generally to be the quote-unquote greatest works of music ever written, or some of the most revolutionary. Why is that so? Why these works? And we'll be digging into that as well as talking about the sheer wonder and awe we do feel when we encounter and listen to these particular works of music. So the greatest works of music, perhaps. And here's an argument why they may be so, but more than that, a thesis about why music does what it does and how it does what it does for us. So we've talked about 3 kind of phenomenological aspects of music. What then are some examples of each of these 3 crucial phenomenological events which compel both interpretation and then solicit our understanding? We have stated the obvious, that music first evokes feeling, not reflection. Musicians, composers, and conductors all agree that the listener must feel first, understand later. We've talked about that already. But what are these feelings we are supposed to experience? And how do they in turn lead us toward a deeper understanding of both art and of ourselves? If we take each experiential, okay, I'm kind of riffing on Heidegger's term, the existential. There's 2 L's at the end of that term. Heidegger's own term refers to the ontic or factual reality of one's life. Okay, so here is the experiential, a phenomenological term that I'm going to use as referring to how that life is experienced by the person, by the subject, in its thrownness. Okay, is if it could be divorced from that flux, that ongoingness, that immanentiality of the present, of the now, and then the next now, and then the next, and we're moving through what we call time in that way. It propels it into the next. We have once again anxiety disposing Dasein toward futurity, and we are beings who are ahead of themselves, as Heidegger likes to say. This is the first of the 3 phenomenological moments regarding music. The second, of course, is the bracketing of the mundane world, the hyletic world, as we spoke of last time, which at the personal level usually includes this ontic level, O-N-T-I-C, that Heidegger speaks of. But within the context of music, this person continues as a vehicle, right? We continue to be both have personal insight as well as for its own temporary oblivion, if you will, in the light of music and in listening to it. And finally, the displacement of ontological structure and ontic narrative by a kind of aesthetic intuition of essences. And Husserl's term for that is, of course, Wesensschau. At once both authenticity as the experience of my own personhood over against the transcendentality of music, art more generally, and as well simply the ontos of being present in the face of this aesthetic experience. Right? We can recall now how with imagery, this object is so because it both presents itself as immanent presence in the present, carrying with it whatever past it may have and represencing it, and as well from this objects to our own presence. We use this term both as a noun and as a verb in Heideggerian fashion. Okay? The art object is an object in the world that we encounter, but its power is that it objects to our own presence in that encounter. Okay? It submits us to questioning in the same way that a great work of art can compel soul-searching on our part, or a sense of wonder, not only at existence, but at the idea that such existence could be transcended in some manner of our own making. So music performs its own most objection to who we have been, while at once perhaps celebrating this or that aspect of ourselves which can more or less immediately perform, in its own turn, a self-recognition. We say to ourselves then, I am not what I thought I was, but I am also that which music can know. In this, We have our first Wesensschau, intuition of essence, and we behold an aspect of the movement from the ontical, the everyday world, the factual reality, to the world of being, to the ontological. As with the visual arts, the discourse of music history has identified a number of key works, which, according to the ontic history of expertise and critical reaction, embody the deepest body of disembodiment, the most radical and visceral inversion of one's being. Recall Sir Simon Rattle speaking about how he felt he had been turned inside out, quite literally, when he first encountered a Mahler symphony. And thus the greatest disclosure of beingness as its generalized force in human consciousness, and perhaps for some, the more. We will ask the question regarding the fairness of simply saluting such a list of works at the end of this chapter, but for now, let us try to understand why these masterpieces of music have, over time, become so iconic, not merely as discursive events, but as phenomenological objects in the transcendental sense of the phrase. This understanding, however, will itself be guided by and ensconced in our three hermeneutic processes, lensed through Heidegger's trifecta of phenomenological experientialities, if you will, those which cannot at once be disclosed to us so transparently outside of our encounter with music. So remember, we're kind of relying on music in a way to actually give us this augmented sense of ourselves, okay? To tell us something about who we are that we cannot get from anywhere else in the world and in our experience, and sometimes even with other people. Let's begin with Bach's Mass in B minor, which represents the summa of about 1,000 years of Western music, insofar as anything before Monteverdi can either be understood non-ethnographically or yet known to us at all. But what allows it to have taken its place in such an august pantheon of aesthetic works is his doubling over of this summa, for the Mass also expresses a millennium of belief. Here it is art and religion which combine to first acknowledge the anxiety of humanity and propose to it a novel futurity. As radical as was Christian ethics in its incipience, so too was the sense that the conception of the individual was founded in an individuating Godhead. For the first time, one not only is possessed of one's fate, one is also responsible for it, obviating the older notion of predestination. Okay? So now we are not so determined, but we have some control. We have some say. Depending on the kind of life we live, the kind of person we become, then we shape our own fates. This is a very new and very radical idea. And Bach is fully aware of this seeming contradiction, itself made manifest in his own biography by way of being compelled to witness the death of the vast majority of his own children before he himself passed. Okay, imagine that. One can literally hear these moments interspersed throughout Bach's massive musical corpus. They sound like the subito of nothing other than disbelief, and in their face, the futurity of salvation must then ring the louder. The single-voiced movements of the Mass alternate between a despairing desultory to a hopeful halcyon. Its large choruses, including a number of the most famous of such pieces, proclaim both the judgment and its stunning results. Yet, yes, the idea of an evaluated afterlife predates Christianity by many millennia, can be found in Egypt, Christianity's indirect predecessor, as well as in the East. But Western Christendom, by Bach's time, had already begun to adopt the Protestant line. A person is disposed to a personal God. For Horace recognized no individuals, only souls, upon scales and balances. So this is quite a radical change. The Mass concludes as it begins, reminding the listener of the temporal cycle as well as the timelessness of the other world. Just so, the anxiety with which we enter the work reappears, even if we as a person have been shown its remedy. In Bach, futurity is part of a closed system which balances upon its own self-conception, but nevertheless, there is a difference between the anxiety of the this world and the calling to conscience emanating from the other world. That we today can understand Bach, if not perhaps precisely in the manner by which he understood himself, is testament to the perduring quality not of distinct and contrary worlds, but rather of precisely anxiety and futurity as elemental to Dasein. So it's not historical content that links us with a composer such as Bach, a great artistic creator, or his works, but rather these phenomenological aspects of our very character as a human being. Bach brackets the material world away from the music by having it narrate a soteriology, unlike some of his other major works, including the Passions series, which stick to specific reportage from the Gospels, for example. Okay, so the Passion of St. John and other works such as that. Similarly, we have what would now be thought of as a plot device, a sleight of hand that pronounces by its own druthers the transcendence of both narrative and discourse alike. But this deus ex machina originates in the music itself, and this is so, I believe, for the first time in history. Okay, so that's Bach's Mass in B minor. It's a great lengthy work. I'm not asking you, as if I were still a professor, I'm not asking you to do an assignment here, but dip into it. If you like what you hear or if you're interested, then there are many great recordings, of course, on YouTube and elsewhere. Next up, Beethoven's Choral Symphony. This is Symphony number 9 with its legendary ode, borrowing from Schiller, is also considered to be one such work wherein the all in all is presented and of a piece. Okay? Anxiety and urgency are the theme of its first movement, with its startling beginning, the orchestra tuning up itself before launching into a massive tutti of the first statement. We are carried along on the swelling surf, barely holding on to the flimsy flotsam with which we are graced in our thrownness. Even if we are the newly minted individual, we are at once no different from any other such person in this kind of desperate context. Goya's Disasters of War, we've already taken a look at them. That series gives some visual sense of Beethoven's first movement here, a tempestuous tumult of trembling tribute. In the second, the Scherzo, there is a more definitive, even clipped statement of ordered progression, sounding the means and ends of the new modernity. Dvorak famously borrows these intervals and cadences in his own Ninth Symphony, Scherzo, and Mahler, in seething self-satire, too, nods his head to them in his Ninth's agitated movement. Okay? So there is a resonance of this across another full century of composition. Beethoven's figure thus does refigure itself over the course of an ensuing century, which alone tells us of the momentous character of its stentorian yet stenochoric stasis. Only with the Andante do we gain some relief. This is the transcendence of the subsistential life. Its soaring theme, with its rhythmic and contrapuntal variations, becomes instantly the standard for successive waves of slow symphonic movements, particularly Brahms and Bruckner, no matter how the two of them misunderstood one another as contemporaries. But the rondo form admits to no closure with transcendence, for we as persons as well as listeners must gather together all of the work's themes in the finale. Beethoven's is, of course, in the Ninth, utterly novel, radically departing from previous efforts, including all of his own. Schiller's sentiments announce, as they are themselves announced. It is at once a set play, a designed run, and as well a manner of narrating that indeed these persons who are like us in every way have been able to transcend the mundane world, fire-inspired as they are, and now present themselves in Elysium as acolytes of joy herself. There is thus a triumph of the conception of man over that of God, which is reflective not only of the time period and its own radical shift in self-understanding from Bach to Beethoven, but also a sense that we should be as gods, just as Müller had proclaimed. This is all happening at the same time in the 1820s. Indeed, one could view almost the whole of the Wagnerian repertory as a working out of how such a shift could have occurred at all, both historically and mythically. Wagner asks the question that would, perhaps ironically, become a leitmotif of Nietzsche's own efforts. What must have happened to displace and eventually vanquish not only the gods, but the very idea of God itself? By the mid-19th century, such an interrogation could begin in earnest. Marx's statement, coming in 1844, explaining that, quote, for the communist man, the idea of God cannot exist, unquote, and to Brahms' soulful belief in nothing, this is something that Dvorak speaks of him, more on that in a moment, all testify to the self-encouragement needed to even digest the shock of anti-revelation, itself its own self-contained soteriology, that this world was not only all there was, it was all that was needed. So that is just striking, the whole thing there. Third, we move from Beethoven this time to Wagner, and it is this sentiment which ultimately animates Beethoven into Wagner. In Tristan und Isolde, the next work on our two exclusive list, we witness not only the presciently presented death of love transmuted into the love of death, we also must confront the demise of myth itself, once expressed through romantically inclined erotic love. What grants futurity to the listener-viewer here is the very demythology which backdrops almost all of Wagner's works. After suffering the misery of loss and embracing that loss as one's personal savior, we are made aware of the stunning lengths the lover must go in order to preserve the idea of love in the face not of death, but rather, and perhaps unexpectedly, of life. Isolde's Liebestod is one of those aesthetic moments which also presents an ethic, in order that love itself not die. The lover immolates herself upon the very altar of death. Wagner's love of death thus inevitably gives rise to Mahler's death of love, and as we shall see in a few moments more, it is this second revelation which is at once disillusion and which ultimately liberates humanity from its own provincial emotions. Wagner utilizes two proverbial figures from the Arthurian narratives, themselves glosses upon Lancelot and Guinevere, but this time with the intervening variable being not the monarch, to whom Gwen is already wed and thus loyal in more of an abstract manner than that of personal, but rather the yet more abstract death in itself, surely as well a phenomenological proverb. Isolde seeks to alter our very conception of death, turning it into an object of adoration, supplication, genuflection, and all of this in the most powerful musical sense and sensuality alike. What would it be like to make love with death? Wagner had already explored the utter and shameless sexuality of the orgiastic epic in Tannhauser, with contemporary productions creating a scandal. For Heidegger, this kind of frolic would be an instance of ontological entanglement, getting too involved with the material considerations and factual reality of the world, a distraction from the ontological sense of things. And so it proves for Wagner's hero as well, who must shake it off in order to attain his personal grail. But by the time we get to Tristan and Isolde, the stakes are such that they cannot be peremptorily discarded, either as befitting to a youthful phase of life or as an ideal of the earthly existence. Here, Isolde, realizing she cannot follow her mate whilst alive, seeks then her own death as the ultimate gift of love. Such a motif resonates in the most debased of circles today, as the intent of abusers of youth, to be found in the shades of the internet harm groups, recently labeled terrorists. Even so, self-immolation as the highest act of devotion is perhaps almost a primordial sensibility and ideal, given the altruistic suicide involved in preserving the social contract. So that's something to think about. Even though we absolutely do not sanction any kind of manipulative abuse, we also realize that even the state today asks us to martyr ourselves for it in a crisis. We are no longer persons, we are merely citizens, and then it is our blood sacrifice then that is the highest gift that we can give to this abstraction that kind of centers the society in which we live. We will give literally our lives to preserve our way of life. That's something to think about. We will give our lives to preserve our way of life. And this is primordial, seemingly. In the same time period as Wagner's demythology, we encounter Brahms's own version of same. In a sense, the latter's is yet more radical, for it uses directly scripture from the very tradition it is eulogizing. In this, the only allegory which is involved is that of the original narrative text. So this is in some ways, this is not usually thought, Brahms is not usually thought of as more radical than Wagner, but here's an instance where it's quite plausible that he is, with the German Requiem, which is our next work on our list. The German Requiem, with its composer himself stating that it more truly is a requiem for all of mankind, for all of humankind, is the penultimate work on our exemplary list. At once we are taken back into the emotional sensate of Bach, and this through the very structure of the music itself, its highlighting of dramatic contrapuntality, the most salient of such. Dvorak's regret, and indeed shock, at realizing that the great soul of Brahms, a soul which could imagine and create such a work as the Requiem, yet believed in nothing. Brahms, of course, was a well-known atheist, is well taken here. Each of us is confronted with the transcendental quality as one aim of art, a quality which transcends even the loss of the conception of the transcendent itself. Brahms leaves nothing to the imagination otherwise. His division of labor between male and female lead voices tells us of the anxiety rooted in the world and the futurity offered by the other world. That the latter has ceased to exist calls into question the former status. The man recaps the problem, the woman the solution, but all this against the wider backdrop of the work, in fact, being a requiem of itself. This is not a requiem of music itself, of course, because music continues, but the idea that the requiem could have any meaning by the time we roll into Brahms, even though there are others, Verdi's and Bruckner's, of the same time period, Brahms is saying, no, this is a requiem of the idea of the requiem. This is the coup with which Brahms both attests and expresses. Music is now itself both anxiety and futurity, and how could it not be so, given that with the loss of worlds and gods alike, the old conception of humanity trails away, discursively, from Marx through Nietzsche to Freud. But musically, also from Beethoven through Wagner, and, oddly enough, to Brahms. The Requiem mourns everything except music, and in this it takes its place as one of the greatest testaments to both transcendence and its loss. Okay, so that's Brahms, the German Requiem. Again, very well worth listening to through whole, even though it is, of course, another lengthy work. Finally, on our list, Mahler's Resurrection Symphony, Symphony No. 2, is oft-cited as the most recent of the epitomes of musical works. This time, even though we are presented once again with the now very familiar triumph over death theme, we are unsure as to what exactly coincided that there should in fact be such a victory. Mahler imputes that it may be simpler than we had imagined. Could not death itself be dead? Okay, so Mahler is really going to the nth degree here, following Bach and Beethoven and Wagner and Brahms. Okay, could not death itself be dead? The extension and augmentation of Beethoven's Ninth is at first the most obvious homologue. This is at once Mahler reaching for the next version of Beethoven, if you will, just as Nietzsche could well say that he doubted better than Descartes, but as well transfiguring it, not so much musically per se, but rather in the alignment of forces ranged against death. In Beethoven, we discover that joy is the ultimate arbiter of the good life. For him, saying yes to one joy is not equal to also affirming all sorrows, as Nietzsche famously has it, but overmatches the latter in both its force and singularity. Sorrow does not distinguish us with the same nobility as does joy. We have not entirely abandoned this romantic notion. Witness the parley of any counselor who works with the bereaved. But in Mahler we find a catalogue of the manifestations of joy, sensuality, love, ardor, transcendence, even filial piety. Mahler casts the older female voice as maternal to, the younger as lover of, the hero. The chorus is that of life itself, unaffected by the death of any one of its individual scions. It is this perennial quality, assembled at first from mere quantity, that elevates humanity from its animal origins and allows us egress from its perduring animalistic inclinations. With the Resurrection Symphony, we witness not so much a restatement of an ancient trope, but rather a coming to terms with all that has interceded on our behalf between an evaluated afterlife and that now unevaluated, and more than this, made uncertain in itself, that death is itself dead. Okay? Mahler thus evaluates life as living, and thus the living by how they indeed live, and only uses the overcoming motif as a metaphor for self-overcoming, very aware of Nietzsche's sense that one must die many times in order to become immortal. After all, is it not his "The World is Deep," which appears in Mahler's very next symphony, that explicates the stakes of this individuated transcendence? Okay. So we've taken ourselves through 5 kind of canonical musical works, the Mass in B minor, Symphony No. 9, Tristan und Isolde, the German Requiem, and the Resurrection Symphony, Symphony No. 2. All of those, of course, are enormously wondrous and astonishing works. They continue to be performed regularly. They are never out of the classical canon or of the pedigree of serious music. And so we've kind of tried to explore a little bit, as well as describing some of the drama of these works, why they have this perduring quality. What is their phenomenological disposition to the listener? So I hope that you've enjoyed this, and we have one more part of music to go before we move into our final section, and we'll go from there. Thanks again.